Please turn in it to Acts chapter 14. This is where we'll be today. You know, one of the things about being a Christian, I don't know if this is your experience, maybe I'm the only one, but it seems to me it's hard, and we talked about it a little bit in Sunday school this morning. Everybody has things in their life that they continually fall back into. Some thought pattern, something from the past that plagues us, something that we're doing that we continue to do, like we have some fight. I can think of lots of those in my own home where Jackson would push our buttons, and I would think to myself, I'd go to Becky and I'd say, boy, you know, if I could just not react that way when he does that, I'm not going to do that next time. And in the very next hour, Jackson would push our buttons again, and I'd do the same thing. We've all got things like that. And I wish they would go away, but they don't. But the problem that I see is we get defeated, and then it's very hard to go back to that spot where we are defeated, I think. Especially if there's a lot at stake. Let's take a look at this text. Chapter 14, verse 1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. They spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed the gospel. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against Paul and Barnabas. So they spent a long time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed their message of grace by enabling them to do miraculous signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some were siding with the Jews, others were siding with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among the Gentiles and the Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat Paul and Barnabas and to have them stoned. But Paul and Barnabas found out about the plot and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news. We're going to stop there, and we'll continue with the text a little later. Paul and Barnabas have traveled, once they make this 90-mile trip from Antioch of Pisidia, which is on this same island, they travel 90 more miles to Iconium. They leave there, and then they travel another 90 to Lystra and Derbe. They're making about a 300 and something mile circuit on this island. They've traveled a long way, and they're doing it on foot. The gospel has this effect everywhere they go. They go to the synagogue first, they preach. Some of the Jews there become stirred. Many Jews and Gentiles believe, but these cities all become divided, and this city is no exception, such that there's even a plot to have them killed. But this way of dividing people by the gospel, I've heard this so many times in my life from people who look at Jesus and they have some admiration for him, but they don't believe. And they see Jesus as kind of like the song, but I understand where this guy's coming from. He's telling it like it is. But the picture of Jesus as this peace bringer, he's not. He is not a peace bringer. Jesus said it himself. Listen to these words. I'm going to read them from Matthew chapter 10. Don't think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. I came to set a man at odds against his father, the daughter against her mother, the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law. A person's foes will be those of their own household. The one who loves father or mother more than me isn't worthy of me. The one who loves son or daughter more than me isn't worthy of me. The one who doesn't take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The one who finds their life will lose it. The one who loses their life for my sake will find it. That's Jesus. That doesn't sound peaceful to me. That sounds like a challenge to everything we would think about when somebody says peace. I have a friend, and we were good friends, and we still are, but the time and distance has made that friendship somewhat less than it was. We got together every Tuesday morning. I would wake up at, I guess I left the house around 5 o'clock because it was about a 45-minute drive to this restaurant where we would meet at 5:50, and we would have breakfast every Tuesday morning. Every Tuesday morning at the King Street Grill. They had the best breakfast burrito. It was a big old thing. Anyway, he and I would talk about the gospel, we talk about the Bible, we talk about philosophy, and we talk about our families. And he and his wife had 2 boys. They were both teenagers at this point, and the one boy, they were going to have a baby. Now, when he told me that, we were sitting down at breakfast, and he said, oh, by the way, my wife and I are going to have a baby. And I'm looking at him thinking, are you nuts? I mean, you got these two boys, you've almost raised them, you're wanting to start over. They wanted to have a baby, so they did. Child came, grew up. This is all quite some distance in the past. And then about 7 years ago, I got an email from him. We've stayed in contact. And the email came to me and said, the little boy's name was Nate. He's Nathaniel, Nate. He said, Nate is going to the mission field. And they had sent, just like Becky and I, they had sent their son off to college. The son was in school, doing well, no problems. There was nothing about the college career that seemed like it was derailing. Grades were good, everything's good. But he had gone to some mission conference on the campus with one of the parachurch mission organizations, Campus Crusade or one of those, and a missionary had come and talked about the mission field, and he felt the call of God to become a missionary. And my friend who emailed me related the story to me in terms that were less than filled with compliments and excitement. Because he and his wife wanted their son to grow up, to be somebody, to achieve, to have success in this country as a whatever he was going to do. Jesus said, I came to bring a sword. He became a missionary. He's still on the mission field now. That's probably been 7 or 8 years ago now. He is in a foreign country as a missionary still to this day. So Jesus' gospel challenges us at those deep levels, those places where we define our lives as peaceful. The gospel comes and challenges those places. Now, Iconium is an interesting city. I don't know if you're aware of this or not. Who knows what the oldest city on the earth claims itself to be today? Does anybody know? Oh, that's not a city. No. Damascus, Syria is claimed to be the oldest city on the earth. And they were claimed to be the oldest city in the time when Paul and Barnabas were traveling. But there was another city, and that was the city of Iconium. And it claimed itself to be the oldest city. And they had a saying in Iconium, it said, since the time of Nenacus. Nenacus was a king who lived way back in the ancient past. And so it kind of like we say, well, that's as old as the dinosaurs. They were saying since the time of Nenacus, that meant a time in the past when nobody could remember. Nobody's certain that Iconium's gone now, but nobody's certain whether or not that city was actually that old. But it's in an interesting part of the country. This part of the country, and I did a little research on this because I was very interested to understand what Phrygia is. What is Phrygia? Well, it's you've got Syria and you've got Cappadocia. And this landmass in between was known as Phrygia at this time in history. They are a warlike culture. Now, why is that? I thought that's interesting. See, I'm a musician. And one of my favorite studies in music was the modes. And you may not know anything about the modes. The modes are where you take a scalar, say you've got the key of C, and you superimpose the key of B flat over C. And you play from B flat to B flat, but use the notes of the key of C. And there are a bunch of these modes. One of them is called the Phrygian mode. Mm-hmm. The Phrygian mode is an ancient musical scale. It comes from the time of the Greeks when Paul and Barnabas were traveling, and even prior. Like the Lydian mode. The Phrygian mode was a mode that was known in music at the time when Paul and Barnabas were traveling, and it was known as the music of war. These people were a warlike people. It's interesting, when you study ancient music history, you find, especially in these pockets of the world in which they aren't necessarily connected with Western European understanding of what music is, the music reflects their life in some way. Not like our music. Our music became experimental. Those musical genres reflect the people from which they come, and the Phrygians were no exception. They were warlike. All right, so Paul and Barnabas are in Phrygia, and they're talking to these warlike people. They are taking their lives in their hands to bring the gospel to them because the people were so easily stirred. And this is a region of the Roman Empire that's far-flung. Up until the Up until about 1900 in this country, if you were in trouble with the law in, say, Massachusetts, and you wanted to hide, all you had to do was go west. Mm-hmm. Go west, cross the Mississippi River, and get into the Western Territories, and you could, Wyatt Earp fled from the law and became, whatever he became, legendary or whatever, lived his life unto old age, because he fled west from the law. He was supposed to be hanged, but he fled west. And you could do that then because the territories were far flung and we didn't have police, we didn't have people. The whole idea of the Texas Rangers and the Marshals and all of that came from the idea that we need to enforce the law out there. Well, in the Roman Empire, it was the same. So when you went off the coast where Rome was, and left Palestine and went out into the surrounding districts, you were leaving the Roman Empire, and the Rome's reach was there. They taxed them, but there wasn't a lot of police enforcement of anything. So, in this country, in Iconium, had they decided, we're going to kill Paul and Barnabas, we're tired of this, they could have done it, and nobody would have known. Paul and Barnabas would have disappeared, and that would have been it. Well, they hear the plot that they're going to be stoned, so they flee to another city. They go to Lystra and Derbe, but they're still in Phrygia. They're still with these dangerous people. So that's where we pick the text up in verse 8. In Lystra there was a man crippled in his feet who was lame from birth, and he'd never walked. He listened to Paul, and as he was speaking, Paul looked at the man and saw that the man had faith to be healed and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths and garlands to the city gates, because he and the crowd wanted to sacrifice offerings to Paul and Barnabas. But when the apostles heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, what are you doing? We're only men just like you. We are bringing to you the good news, telling you to turn from the worthless things to the living God who made heaven and earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he did not leave himself without a testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in the seasons. He provides you with food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing a bull to them. Okay, what happened? There's a lame man. Paul sees that the man has faith. I don't know how you see that, but I guess if you're filled with the Holy Spirit, you can look at somebody and see that they have faith to be healed. And Paul calls him out, and he is healed. And what happens? Well, a religious celebration breaks out in the town. But it doesn't break out in the way that Paul and Barnabas would have liked to have seen it break out. Why is that? Why did this happen? Well, they call Barnabas Zeus, or Jupiter if you're a Roman, because he had that kind of quiet demeanor, and Paul's the one who did all the talking, so he was called Hermes, or Mercury if you're a Roman. And the religious festival is to them. Why? You ever think of why did that happen? There's a reason for it. There's a myth connected with this city. The myth goes this way. Zeus and Hermes came to Lycaonia. And when they got there, to Lystra, actually, when they got there to Lystra, they came disguised. It reminds me a lot of Soren Kierkegaard's King and the Maiden, when the king comes disguised because he wants the hand of the maiden. And they came and nobody knew that it was Zeus and Hermes. Well, nobody took them in. Nobody would lodge them. Nobody would give them food, except one elderly couple took them in. So they destroyed the whole city. They wiped it out, killed everybody, except this elderly couple. And when this elderly couple died, before they died, they turned them into trees so that they would live forever. Now that's the myth. These people believe it. And so that Barnabas and Paul are there. This man's been healed. Zeus and Hermes have returned. Well, we're not going to let that happen again. We're not going to let them wreck the city, so they bring the bull out to sacrifice to them. Isn't that the way it is sometimes with us, that we exalt the messenger and not pay attention to the message? We do. Paul seizes the opportunity. He says, I'm going to preach the gospel from this platform of this paganism. I'm going to tell them. And you'll notice something about this preaching. He does this twice in the book of Acts. He'll do it again in Acts 17. He doesn't pull out his Torah and start preaching the prophets to these Greeks. He talks about the earth. He talks about the sun and the seasons and the crops and the rains, and that God has made everything in the sea and on the earth and put us in our places here. He preaches what is known as natural theology. There is such a lesson for us there. We just take one social ill. We talked about it in Sunday school today. Take abortion. Take that one social ill. What happens when one of our luminaries are called to go somewhere and stand on television or someplace else and speak out against abortion? What do? They quote the Bible. As soon as somebody says, oh, it says in Jeremiah, you've lost 2/3 of your audience just like that. They're not paying any more attention to you because you're going to quote the Bible and they don't care. Paul doesn't do that. He doesn't take his Torah scroll out and start quoting Isaiah to these people. He talks about what everybody knows. There's an earth, and it's miraculous in its machinery, and life is miraculous in its machinery, and we have crops, and we have rain, and we have all these things that have been provided for us. He preaches natural theology. You see, the way into people's hearts is not always the Bible. We forget that. The Bible has power. It is God's word unto salvation. But it's not the first word there too. There's the book of nature too. And people hear that. They'll hear that. During the time of Napoleon, I was reading in preparation for this, and I thought that's an interesting little quip. Napoleon, you may not be aware of this, Napoleon was a Christian. He was a believer. Now, he exercised that in a strange way, but he was a believer. And it happened on several occasions that it would come out, this idea of him being a believer. Well, at the time when Napoleon was doing what he did, that was right at the heat of the Enlightenment and the scientific age and Laplace and all of these people who were saying we don't have need of God to explain anything anymore. That's the atmosphere that Napoleon lived in France especially. I mean, that was the place where Madame Liberty was set up in the square, and all of that was happening in his country. That was the atmosphere in people's minds. And two of the soldiers were sitting there around the campfire, and they were arguing with each other regarding the fact of, does God exist or not? And Napoleon overheard it, and he walked over to the two guys at the campfire, and he said, just take a look up. He said, you see all that up there, don't you? They said, yes. He said, who made that? Mm-hmm. Who made that? Natural theology. There's a way in. The scriptures are not always the best way in to somebody's mind. Let's continue with the text. Verse 19. Some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul. They dragged him outside the city thinking him dead. But after a while the disciples had gathered around him, and he got up and went back into the city the next day, and he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Now, they've been following Paul, and scholars are disputing this. They say, well, maybe these were some Jewish merchants that just happened to be in this region of the world selling grain from Palestine, because Palestine grew a lot of grain. Nobody's really sure whether they were that or whether it was just some Jewish guys that said, we're going to follow these guys and pester them to death and shut this way down. But they had stirred this Phrygian warlike crowd, which was easily stirred, and they stoned Paul. They talked them into stoning him. Now, why did they drag Paul outside the city after they stoned him? There's a reason for it. You know why that is? Nobody under Roman law was allowed to execute anybody except the Romans. So they've broken the law and they know it. So if we just take the corpse and drag it outside the city and leave it, the dogs will get it, and we won't have to worry, and nobody will know way out here on the fringes of the empire. Nobody's going to know that we've killed Paul. But then Paul wakes up. Now this text is an interesting text. If you read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says, there was a man I don't know, whether in the body or out of the body, I'm not sure, who has seen things that are inexpressible. He was taken up to the third heaven. Most scholars that I've read say they believe Paul died here. He was stoned to death. He was dead. I mean, after all, if you're going to drag somebody outside the city, It says dragged. Didn't say carried. A dead body, why be careful with it? Let's just grab him by one leg and drag him out and get rid of him. You would think if he was alive, he might have waked up from that. So the scholars say that Paul actually was raised from the dead here. And that these disciples, it says disciples, that's interesting because all you had was Barnabas and Paul. Obviously, some of the people in the city had been converted to Christianity. And they're standing around Paul, and Paul gets up. And what does he do? He goes right back. I guess he followed the trail of the marks in the dirt where they drug his body out to that spot and goes right back into the city where he's just been stoned to death. What kind of witness was that? Can you imagine being one of those who had the bag of rocks? And here's the guy you just saw bleeding and dying and dead and left for dead, and he's walking back into the city. I bet you a lot of people became believers then when they saw that. Who knows what kind of sacrifices they were willing to make at that point. This brings me to where I want to funnel this down for you and me. Do we ever find ourselves discouraged as Christians? I do. I'm discouraged today. I'm not going to tell you why, but I am. Do we ever find ourselves thinking, is it really worth it to get up and keep going as a believer? It's fine if Christianity fits into your orbit or my orbit of living in a very convenient way, that's great. But what if it doesn't? What if expressing myself or you expressing yourself as a believer costs you something? What if that? Do you get discouraged about that? I do. Do you think Barnabas and Paul were discouraged? I would say stoning would discourage most people. This is the problem that the gospel faces today. On the one hand, people hate it. But then there's an even more dangerous place. It's that place where people look at Jesus and they like him. They're in what a friend of mine said, they are in like with Jesus. Not in love with him, but they're in like with Jesus. And they like the idea of the peaceful, mild Jesus and the man who's just the Breck hair, in the pictures we have, the European Jesus on the wall of so many churches. Looks like he just came out of the salon with the blow dry and everything. I mean, that's the Jesus they want. But then Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. We like the baby Jesus at Christmas time. We like the sentimental. There are two ways that people come at him. One is they say, I hate this gospel. I don't want it. The other is they come at it and they say, I really like Jesus. I'm going to take him on board like a kind of a buddy. And I'm going to talk about him in nice ways, but I will never surrender my heart to him and say he's Lord. That's a big difference, a big difference. When Jesus isn't the way we want him to be, there are two things that happen. We either kill him. Remember, Hosanna, throwing the palm branches down, and then just a few days later, crucify him. We do that, or we make him as we want him to be so that we can be comfortable with him. Either way, he's not Lord. Either way. I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything I've said about which